Here. So I've been a veteran of the game industry for about 26 years, 13 of which was spent at Microsoft, and the rest has been self-employed as consultant ever since. My background, I'm a geographer and a cartographer who for some reason works in video games. So I do this culturalization work in which I help game developers essentially avoid political and cultural mistakes in their games so they don't get banned by certain governments, or so consumers don't get all upset about something that you put in a game. But that's not what we're talking about today. We're talking about more of an advocacy focus, like how can we make this game industry perceived more positively in the public? This is something that I've also been working on in my career. It's why I took the job running the International Game Developers Association for 5 years, because in my later years in my career, I've become much more concerned about the life of you, the people who make these games that I love, and the people I love to work with, and the welfare of them, whether it's working hours, whether it's inclusion, whether it's fairness with how indies get treated by publishers, all of these things. I want to see this industry get better, and I want to see it improve for its own good, but as well as for the perception of the public. Because I actually think this is still a huge problem, and I find that a lot of developers feel that it is a problem, but they're unwilling sometimes to actually do much about it. So what concerns me is every time that we see, like in the United States, for example, we'll be summoned in front of the president to explain why video games are violent or why video games are a problem. And every time we see this kind of thing, to me, this is a gross failure of our industry. And in the US, we've seen this time and time again. I mean, Hillary changed her opinion a little bit about video games, but there was a time where they still see, and a lot of politicians in North America still see games as a threat. I know we see that throughout the world. It's certainly not a phenomenon unique to the United States. But this is, again, it's a failure. It's our failure. You may not know who this person is, but this is Jack Thompson. He was a real tool of a person. He was a senator in the U.S. Congress way back in the 90s. And he is the reason why the ESRB rating system was created. He's the reason why the Entertainment Software Association that runs E3 was created. He's also the reason why the IGDA was created, because this guy was on a warpath to prevent video games from being sold. He was convinced that games cause violence and that they must be regulated and stopped. And of course, like I said, this is not unique to the United States at all. We see these examples in a lot of other governments around the world, where they just don't see the point in supporting video games. Of course, we had something just last year around the whole issue of loot boxes here in Belgium, where Belgium led the way on banning loot boxes, and a lot of other countries followed suit. And again, I think this is a failure. This was a failure of EA and how they handled the loot box issue. It's a failure of the industry for how a lot of people responded to this issue as well. And we see this kind of meme all the time in the public, where games are portrayed as negative, this evil influence on children, that they're a waste of time. This was actually the label that the state of California was trying to put on video games at one point. This is what led to the Arnold Schwarzenegger case, because he used to be governor of California, which led to a whole court case that I'll mention in a minute. And of course, I felt like I have to put this meme in there because it's, appropriate. But so it really bugs me, though, about this issue of the public narrative, about who controls the public narrative about our profession and about what we do. And unfortunately, it's not us. We are not the ones in control of it, and we have not even tried, in my opinion, to really try and control it over the last several decades as our industry has grown. Typically, what we hear in the public are very common misperceptions are things like this: that games are mostly played by kids, mostly boys, that games are a waste of time, they cause violence, they cause obesity, they are not good for your brain. And of course, game developers are portrayed in a very negative way too. We're often considered to be lazy. We can't get a real job, so we do game development instead. I think that second one is really funny. Motivated only by money. Obviously, they don't know anything about game development. So for most people who are in the game industry, and or they think we sit around thinking about how violent can we make the game. So, we do sometimes. I worked on the Dead Rising series, and we actually did have discussions about that, but in a different way, not the way that they're thinking. So in the US, In 2011, we had this huge event happen. The Supreme Court decision decided that video games they qualified for First Amendment protection or free speech protection, which for the United States was a massive milestone. So now games are seen on the same level as literature, movies, art, all these other things. We are protected by free speech. So basically that means that any state or any government entity within the United States can't regulate video games. And even the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land, they even said that there's no compelling connection between violent video games and children behavior. And so they dismissed that whole issue of violence as being related to video games. And yet just a few years ago, we had this study come out in the US where adults in the US, where 40% still believe that games cause violence. They flat out believe they do cause violence. They think it's a waste of time. 60% believe most people who play games are men, which we know for a fact is not true. It's about gender parity in most places around the world where games are played. And this one is really funny, where 23% think that games don't promote teamwork and communication. They've obviously haven't played a game in the last 10 years because so many of our games take place in an online environment and in a team environment that basically a lot of the games that we have now essentially teach those skills where people are not usually learning them otherwise. Now, typically when we are thinking about the game development ecosystem in any market around the world, this is what it looks like. We have the industry, we've got government, and we have education. Those are like three of the big pillars. And this is highly simplified, but for the sake of time, I'm not going to go into make a very complicated diagram here. But you have at least these three key pieces to make a healthy ecosystem in any location. Now, the relationship between the game industry and the government is typically overseen by trade associations. So like I mentioned, in the United States, it's the Entertainment Software Association, and we've got like UKI in the UK. There's all kinds of other associations all around the world that serve as that bridge between government and the industry. And between education and government, often education relies on government money for research, so we could research the impact of video games. And of course, the education side provides knowledge and skills to the industry, and the industry helps inform education on what we actually need, the kind of skills that we're looking for. Now, in the midst of all this, oftentimes I've noticed in the dialogue that we have on the industry side, we kind of forget about the people who are all around us, who are the public. We are part of the public, of course, but usually from the game industry standpoint, we view the public as those people who actually buy our stuff, and that's what they basically are. We rarely see, in my opinion, with a lot of the developers I talk to, we rarely see the public as actually being fellow advocates of games as an art form and fellow advocates of what we do, even though these people are playing our stuff and they love what we're doing, but we don't often see them that way. We see them as consumers rather than as partners in actually promoting games as the art form that it is. Now, I always assumed, especially when I was running the International Game Developers Association, I always assumed that the trade associations, and these are just a sample of them, I thought that their job was to be that public face of our industry and to reach out to the public and basically promote games as this positive force. Now, a lot of them do to some degree, but more of what they do, like I said, they're promoting that image to the government, because oftentimes that results, like here, just this news last week about potentially getting a tax shelter for video games in this country, which is fantastic. I mean, that's a great thing that you see trade associations do, and that's again an interface with the government to get that kind of tax break. Just like the Supreme Court example I gave earlier, that was a victory by the Entertainment Software Association, and it was a major victory, and it was done because of them. However, what we see is this public perception of what we do has not changed, and it continues to be pretty negative. Now, some people have told me, why worry about it? Because in another maybe 20 years, everyone's going to be playing video games, and everyone will have grown up with video games. So, eventually everyone's going to view games in a positive way. That might be true, but honestly, I don't want to wait. I don't see the reason why we have to wait for that to happen and wait for that generational effect to happen. So really, who is the voice of the global game industry? And ultimately, It's you, and it's me, and it's everybody who works in the industry. We are the ones who are the best advocates for our work. That's why if you look to other creative media like Hollywood, for example, and the filmmakers, they are often very vocal. You will see actors and directors and other people who are actually involved in the creative process. They'll be very vocal in the media about protecting the integrity of how their art form is viewed, but we rarely have that in the game industry. So what's the number one issue preventing us from being better advocates? And I would ask this as an open question, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to say, generally speaking, it's us. It's every one of us that I find that we block ourselves from taking that additional step of being more of an advocacy-minded or advocacy-focused kind of person, and we're just so busy, heads down, doing our work, which obviously that's really important, but also taking a little sliver of time to think about how our work is perceived and impacted, and what can we do to take that extra step to promote our work as the art form that it is. Now, just so a lot of people will ask, or they'll say to me when I bring this up, well, who am I anyway? I'm just a programmer on this project, or I'm just an artist over here. What in the world can I do? I don't have what it takes. And, of course, a lot of us in this industry are introverts, which doesn't help either. I'm an introvert. I'm an admitted introvert, and yet I'm here on stage, so I'm faking extroversion for this time that I'm here. But I'll use my own example to kind of show, why am I so big on advocacy in this industry? And so I asked the same question to myself, who am I? Well, any one of us can apply different labels to ourselves. We all serve different roles in our life. There's different things that we do, and we devote our time to different things. The geek part of me is very clear. This is me giving a lecture on Halloween in Norway a few years ago. I'm so geeky that I'm dressed as Indiana Jones, but I'm demonstrating force lightning because I'm talking about my work on Star Wars: The Old Republic. So it gets worse because, when I go to Dubrovnik for the Reboot conference, my friends and I recreate scenes from Game of Thrones. Or when the week before Gamescom, I was in Ireland, so I went to Skellig Michael, and I just had fun recreating scenes from Star Wars. So, yeah, it gets even worse. You'll see. My path into the game industry, like a lot of people's paths, especially if you're an older generation like myself, we didn't have a direct access to the game industry because there was no real industry. We didn't have game design schools. So this is what my path looked like. I originally wanted to be an astronaut because I grew up during the Apollo era. I was 4 years old when the US landed on the moon, and that was really inspiring. That's why there's two things grayed out up there, because I did not do them. I was not an astronaut, and I was not a conceptual artist on Star Wars, even though I wanted to be. But all these other things are basically the path that I took into the industry, and I've been able to do a lot of really cool stuff during that time. But in my case, even after, I got to about the point, I would say almost 20 years into the industry, I was really doubting my ability to basically deliver on my expertise. And I know a lot of us encounter this sometimes. And this is also one of the things that was holding me back from being a better advocate and being willing to speak out about things beyond just my work. And so for me, part of the problem was basically the matrix. This was my problem. And so let me explain. So I've seen The Matrix many, many times, and there is only one movie, by the way, but I've seen The Matrix many times, and the Seattle Symphony, where I'm based in Seattle, they did this symphony where they did the entire score live with the orchestra while they showed the movie above the stage, and the composer of the music, Don Davis, he was there conducting the orchestra, so it's super cool. Well, we get to this point in the movie, and if you haven't seen this movie, you should. I realize it's celebrating its 20 years old this year, but there's this point in the movie where Morpheus, the mentor-type character, says to the protagonist, Neo, he says, "Don't think you are, know you are." And now when I'm sitting there in the symphony hall watching this, and I've seen this movie 100 times, I suddenly just started crying my eyes out. And the reason is because I was seeing this at a time where I was wondering, why is it so difficult for me when I send my feedback to any kind of game project or any other client I have? Why do I feel like this is the moment that they're going to find out that I'm a total fraud, that I don't know what I'm talking about, And so basically that is what we call imposter syndrome. And I know a lot of people in this industry suffer from it, and a lot of people I have found that's one of the reasons that kind of holds them back, not only professionally, but it holds them back from being better advocates. That's why I'm giving this little public service announcement about imposter syndrome. And what I realized is that with this phrase, don't think you are, know you are, why it hit me so hard, it was this idea that disbelief in my own skills that doesn't mean I don't have skills. It's just that I'm not able to perceive what other people are perceiving in me. And so it was important to know the realities of what others see in you, even if you struggle to think if you have those skills or not. It was a very difficult lesson for me to learn. And as I've talked to a lot of people since then, and I mentor a lot of students and other people in this industry, I find that this is so common. This imposter syndrome is so insidious. So this is basically what imposter syndrome looks like. So you basically, if you're in a room or a classroom of fellow students, or you're in a studio with other people, you basically are sitting there thinking that what I know is just this tiny little bit, and everyone around me has this vast body of knowledge that they draw from. But the reality is that it's more like this. What you know is pretty much the same as what everyone around you knows. It's just you know it a little bit differently. If you're in a room full of artists, every single artist is unique. Everyone approaches the style differently. They approach the technique differently. That doesn't necessarily always make someone better or worse. Somebody might be better at a certain technique, but their art style is their art style. That will always be unique to somebody. And yes, if you think that looks like a Death Star, it's correct. That's intentional. So think of flowers, not Death Stars. Don't think of imposters. Think of nice flowers instead. For example, if I put this on the screen and ask you which one is better, and I always get people saying, well, that the left or the right. And if you don't know, that is Rembrandt on the left, and that is Picasso on the right. Considered two of the greatest artists in human history, and yet their styles could not be more different, and yet they're considered masters at art. And so this is one of those things where comparison is just a killer to the thought process that we go through. Even in our own industry, I think people look at these two things and they'll say, well, obviously the one on the left is better. It's like, well, it depends what it's for. I mean, actually doing that, the art style on the right is an art unto itself. It's a specialty unto itself. There's nothing wrong with it. It doesn't matter if it's low res. It's just different. So I think it's really important for a lot of us to get past that and to try and cope with that so that we can move on. This quote from Mark Twain, the American writer, I think is really appropriate, where he said, comparison is the death of joy. And I've seen this happen so many times in our industry where people let that idea of comparison, like I will never be as good of an artist as that person or a better programmer than them. But honestly, that if you find someone like that, guess what? You just found a potential mentor. You can go ask them and say, hey, can you teach me how to do this? Because I would love to know. I want to get better at what I do. And I think if all of us work better at that and try and help each other out, and I think generally speaking, the game industry, it is very collaborative in that way. And that's one of the reasons I love working in this industry, because many people, they really do go out of their way to help each other. And it's very collaborative. And so I think it's important, whatever adversity you might have, that it might be holding you back, you have to find a way to get through it. You have to embrace it as your crucible or as your forge. Or if you follow the writings of Joseph Campbell, who wrote the book, The Power of Myth, upon which George Lucas and others have based a lot of their stories, he called it the supreme ordeal, that every hero has to go through basically being normal at the beginning. They go through some supreme ordeal and they come out the other side and they embrace their superpowers, and they suddenly have a desire to wear spandex and flex their muscles. Now, when I went through this period myself, it was interesting because I came out the other side of this, and my friends started using this term for me. They said, you seem fierce. You seem fierce now. What happened? And I kind of basically managed to get through that period and shed the matrix and all that other, my weird example. But it started showing because it's around the same time I started cosplaying a lot, because why not? You feel like a hero now. You feel like you've overcome it, so you kind of let it out. And part of that's because my daughter's a costume designer professionally, so that kind of helps. She's the one there on the right. But anyway, when I got back to that question after going through that crucible, I was like, who am I? Well, basically, I'm someone who decided to care and actually do something about it. And that's the only difference. And that's the only difference between me and somebody else who is still sitting there wondering, why is the industry not changing? Why are we not perceived in a more positive way? And a lot of it was being driven by embracing this notion that evil triumphs when good people do nothing. It really pissed me off that I see so many things happen that people just stand around and they don't do anything about it. And I made a conscious decision that this is never going to be me again. If I see something happen, whatever you might perceive as evil, I'm not going to stand by and just let it go. I'm actually going to take action and change things. I think it's interesting because, like, if you saw Wonder Woman, and if you didn't, then I'm ruining the part of the movie. But I love this scene, and I've talked to a lot of people who had a very emotional reaction in this scene where she climbs out of the trench in World War I for the first time, and Steve Trevor says to her, "We can't save everyone in this war. This is not what we came to do." But her response was, "No, it's what I'm going to do." And I think a lot of people, both men and women, have told me they've had an emotional reaction to this scene. And I think part of it is because this is an aspirational thing for so many people. They're like, I wish I could be that person who takes that step. I wish I could be the one willing to have the courage to step forward and actually make change happen. And so one of the things I know that we have a lot in this world today and in this industry, and you can look on any day on social media and see it, is rage. So there's a lot of rage being expressed all the time. I mean, like just this week with the 800 layoffs at Blizzard, Activision Blizzard, that caused me a tremendous amount of rage. People should be really pissed off about that. Because that's ridiculous, especially when the company just announced record profits just the day earlier. I mean, there's a certain injustice going on there that should make people pissed off. But just having rage is not enough. You have to focus that in some way, and that's what I call righteous rage. You have to be angry for a reason, and not just angry for a reason, but willing to do something to change it. Because being angry in itself, that's what Twitter's great for. To me, righteous rage is this reaction of emotion and anger to it's a response to mistreatment, basically a rebuke of injustice is the way I see it. And some people will say, well, gee, that sounds very superhero-ish. You have like a hero complex. I do. I don't care. It works for me. You know, that motivates me and kind of drives me forward. Now, the little secret is that the term righteous rage, basically, that's advocacy. That's what we call advocacy. That's when you're willing to step up and take action against something specific that you care about. That's why if you talk to anybody who runs a nonprofit association, they don't do it for the money, because most nonprofits don't have the money. They do it because they care about that issue, whether it's an environmental issue, a social issue, political, or something else. They're doing it because they care and they have that kind of righteous rage against that specific action and they want it to change. One of the things I think we often forget about in this industry, because we use that term industry all the time, I get a lot of people raging against the industry. They'll say things like, I'm quitting games because this industry screwed me over. This industry did this to me, or this industry did whatever. We have to remember, however, that this industry is not some big machine rolling through this wasteland. The industry is us. Every single one of us is the industry. It is made up of people. It's not some big machine. And so, yes, sometimes if you're talking about larger companies like Activision Blizzard or Microsoft or Sony or any of those big companies, it seems very much like a behemoth that can't be changed, but that's not true. Change can happen from within. I love the company Nordeus that's based in Serbia, where they put this on the back of their T-shirts that our number one game is our people. And I know from talking with the executives from that company, they really believe it. They want the welfare of their talent to come first, and they treat their people well. And I think that's the right perspective to have, is that we have to remember that we are people who are doing a very creative, artistic work. We're not just cogs in a machine. And unfortunately, the way that some companies treat people, it basically perceives them as being a number or being a cog. I'm sure you've heard this term warrior poet before. It's used in some literature. The idea that you can be both strong and forceful, but you also have a certain mindfulness about what you do. I think with us, we need to be adopting an idea of being a creator advocate. So we don't just create games, but we create games, and I don't mean you're making games that are always about some social cause. What I mean is that as you create games, you're mindful of the fact that you're also part of this larger movement in human history that is redefining how people interact with information, will interact with stories, and entertain themselves in their free time. And so being this creator advocate, it kind of helps you think about your work in the broader context of what's going on around you. Now, when I talk about trying to change the industry, both internally and as well as the public perception, a lot of times people will push back, say, well, it's difficult to do, it's impossible or futile, it takes a lot of time, and all I hear is whining to me. There's a lot of examples in human history where just one person, and typically it takes just one person at the right time to say the right thing, and there has been major movements that happen politically, religiously, and other movements that happen because one person decided to step up and make a difference and start changing things. The Me Too movement that happened in Hollywood a couple of years ago, whether or not, however you perceive it, that all happened and came to light because one person had the courage to stand up and say, I'm not taking this shit anymore. And so then others came out and said, well, yeah, we agree because we're tired of this too. And things have changed to a certain degree, but that kind of change takes time, but it has to start somewhere, and it has to start with somebody. So what can we do as creator advocates to force change around this public perception issue? Well, one of the things I think that's super important that I would wish more game developers would do is embrace their craft. So what I mean by that is kind of going back to my comment a few minutes ago, is look at games as what they are. They are not just a technology. They are not just an art form. They are the current evolution of human narrative. They are the current version of how human beings convey stories from one to another. All throughout human history, we've had all these different forms of communication. Yes, these all still exist to some degree, but we are the ones who are currently defining what that means. And that, to me, is exciting. That's really cool. That's something that we should embrace. Of course, we don't get arrogant about it. We don't want to say, well, look at me, I'm defining human narrative. But just keep it in mind that this is an important thing, because oftentimes I meet game developers, or even worse, I meet students who will tell me I'm just a game developer. And I want to slap them and say, you're not just anything. You are defining how human beings are interacting with information and interacting with creative narrative. That's no small task, and you should be proud of it. The other thing, too, is remember the economic power that we have as an industry. I think all of us know this intellectually, but I think it's often we have to remind ourselves of where we stand. So for example, these are the worldwide revenues for different forms of media in 2017. So you can see there that video games, we blew away all these other forms of media. You'll often hear people say, well, games make more money than film and music combined. They do. They do make more money. What's even more staggering is you think of every form of live sports, from FIFA to, American football and all these other forms of live sports all around the world. If you add up all their revenue, we still make more money than they do. And especially when I quote that statistic to people in the public, they can't believe it, because the sports, the live sports are so well promoted, and people hear about, billion-dollar team purchases and things like that. But then you have to remind them, well, yeah, Grand Theft Auto made $1 billion in 1 week. So, the amount of money that our games make is pretty amazing. That the recent Spider-Man game that came out for the PlayStation made more money than the last Spider-Man movie that came out. So the difference is pretty stark, but a lot of people in the public they don't know this. Every time I've quoted simple numbers like this, they're just like, I can't believe this. There's no way. But that's the reality. Another thing that I think is important is we need to demand more fairness in media coverage. And I don't mean games media, obviously. I mean general public media. This is changing slightly, but it's still, this kind of goes back to that public perception issue earlier, that oftentimes when a game gets mentioned in the popular media, it usually has something to do with a negative issue. Like like this happens in the U.S. all the time. There's a shooting, so obviously games are involved. There's a shooting, so they ask, well, what video games was that person playing? That's like one of the first questions they ask to make that association. So we see this stuff all the time, that association is there. And we as an industry, that's the thing that's frustrating me. We don't push back. We don't contact the sources and say, that's not true. The statistics show, this study shows that there's no association. So why do you keep perpetuating that? But we're not doing that. We're not pushing back. The other thing is, I think, pushing for more equal time in mainstream media. This is just an example. These are from newspapers, which obviously newspapers are quickly fading away because people rarely buy them anymore. But the fact that a lot of news outlets will have book reviews, they have, of course, they always have movie reviews, and very few will actually have game reviews, even though the game release is going to make a tremendous amount of money, and it has a huge cultural impact. Something like Fortnite, for example, the amount of cultural impact that Fortnite has had, whether intentionally or not, it's still a huge impact. And it's something that should be acknowledged in the media, but they don't do it. And part of the reason they don't do it is because not only does the industry not try and force it, but the public doesn't either. And that always kind of perplexes me. I often don't understand why that's happening that way. Another thing we have to think about is the potential for new forms of collective representation. So maybe if we're not getting the kind of public perception that we want, maybe we need another entity to help do it. I know there's a lot of talk these days about like unionizations and organized labor in the game industry as a way for the developers, not the companies, which are represented by trade associations, but the actual developers to have more of a voice to promote what they do to the public. And we often see this in Hollywood, and I'm not saying the Hollywood model is necessarily the way we want to go, but we do see that like Hollywood unions like the Screen Actors Guild and the Writers Guild and all those groups, they promote their profession for what they do, basically as actors and as writers, and we don't really have that necessarily. I think a lot of us just sort of assume that people kind of know what we do because we do what we do, and they play our games and they buy our games. But the reality is that I don't really think that's the case. Or there's things like a legal defense fund. A game creator's legal defense fund is actually something I'm launching soon, because I find that a lot of indie developers especially, they don't have the resources to have any legal help to deal with some issues. So that's one of the things I'm trying to do to create some form of leverage for game developers. But I think the last thing that's super important, I think it's honestly one of the most important things that we can do as game creators is to engage the public directly. So don't just engage them with our games and say, well, I made this game, I'm releasing it on Steam or wherever, and they're going to play it, and then therefore they know what my game is. I think we have to open up the black box of game creation and really show people what we do, and to try and help build that respect of our profession. And we see this in film all the time, and I hate to keep drawing that comparison, but with film, the public understands how films get made. There's all kinds of movies about making movies, and so everyone kind of knows that, yeah, you've got a director, you've got actors, you've got cameras, you've got all these things, you go on location or whatever, but I still encounter a lot of people in the public, they have no idea how games get made. They think it's like some secret little room, which sometimes it is, depending on the franchise or whatever, but they just don't understand what goes into making games. And so it's really important for us to be the ones who evangelize to the public and say, hey, this is what we do. I've heard game developers complain to me saying, this certain local government official hates video games and they're attacking us in their statements and everything. And I'm like, well, when's the last time you actually reached out to that person and invited them into your studio and showed them how games are made? So like last year at Gamescom, I was told a story by a colleague from Canada where they were having this very problem with a local member of parliament in one of the provinces of Canada, and they had this member of parliament who was very anti-video game and making a lot of noise about how video games are a waste and all that. So what did they do? They opened their doors to this person, they invited him to come to their studio and visit, and he did, and they showed him the whole works, like, this is our art department. department. These are the programmers. Here's the marketing team. They had him sit down and try like ZBrush and Unity and kind of play with it a little bit. And he found out, wow, these are nice, normal people. They've got families. They have homes. There's nothing wrong with these people. They're not trying to make violent games. They're just trying to make some really cool technology and some really cool art. And in one visit, they flipped this guy 180 degrees. So now he's pro video games because they actually gave him the chance to see how games are made. And so I think we need to do a lot more of that as game developers and be willing, like I said, not just creators, but also advocates of our own work, and be proud of it so that we can just show people, hey, I'd love for you to see not only what we made, but how we made it and what went into it. And of course, that's also a power to help inspire the next generation of developers, because we want people to see what goes into making games. And so I think what I'm proposing here is that we as an industry can do more about engaging that public directly and actually helping the public be better advocates for what we do, and helping them go back to the government or to education saying, hey, this art form, this technology, whatever you want to call it, is really important to me. I want to make sure that you're funding it. I want to make sure you're not attacking it. And I think we need to see more of that. And it does happen from place to place. I mean, obviously, this is an issue that varies widely across geographies. But generally speaking, I see this a lot. And when I do see game developers engaging the public directly, they tend to do a very good job, like the example I just gave, of actually opening people's eyes and helping them understand that we're cool people who are making cool stuff. We're not evil trolls in a basement making violent video games. So I think it's really important, though, when you think about the scope of this, because this is one of the things I hear a lot if I give a talk like this, is people worry, like, you're talking about a problem that is so monumental. It's global in scale, so how in the world are we going to fix this? And that's the point, is that as a creator advocate, your goal is not to change the entire world. Because that's going to be a very difficult thing to do, but your goal should be to change your small corner of it. That's why it's important to pick that issue that really pisses you off and find your righteous rage around it and decide to do something about it. What is that issue? And it could be anything. It could be something in your school. It could be something in your workplace. It could be something with the local government, with the national government, with whatever it might be. But it's important to kind of define what that is and don't just sit on the rage and be pissed off about it. Actually decide to do something about it. And so collectively then, if we all are trying this approach, we can change everything if we're all trying to change our little locale and kind of make a difference. So that's essentially the message that I'm trying to promote. How do we change the public perception? Well, we have to each play our part in doing that. And sometimes we might need to have some kind of collective representation to do it, whatever form that might take. Some people have suggested maybe we need like a public service announcement about the benefits of video games. It's like, yeah, that's cool, but obviously someone has to pay for that, though. But there's a lot of different ideas for how we can change this public perception, but ultimately it has to start with every single one of us making that decision that we actually want that perception to change. Thank you very much.